everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the panelists for being here to discuss the importance of biodiversity and Indigenous knowledge. Biodiversity is truly the foundation for a thriving ecosystem, and in my view, can only truly be safeguarded through Indigenous knowledge. So as all of us here today work in conservation, I believe we'll each have a really unique perspective on why integrating these two ideas is so important. I'm really looking forward to conversing together and having an open discussion here today. So in the spirit of that, I would love to have each one of you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about you and your work, and then we can move forward with some questions. So Justin, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Justin Grubb. I am a couple different things, but one of the main things I do is make films and am a photographer for, conservation programming and stuff. I'm also the communications and outreach program officer for an organization called Planet Indonesia, which is based in Indonesia. And it's a really cool organization that does a lot of community rights work, especially around like governance structures and economics to help make conservation available and really help support those communities to build resilient livelihoods and stabilize local economies so that, resource use is sustainable and they are living very healthy and harmonious lives with nature.
Great. John, would you like to go ahead?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm John Bohorquez. I am a multidisciplinary marine biologist with a few different expertises and areas of expertise in the field, including fisheries conservation with an international scale. But what I'll be talking about most today probably will tie to my experience in conservation finance and protected areas. I have an economics and a finance background before getting a PhD in marine science, but a lot of my work has been blending that to help us understand what the pathways are for sustainably funding a lot of conservation initiatives, which collaboration with business communities is very important for, and is an area that I was drawn to because the majority of marine protected areas, for example, fall short of their conservation goals, oftentimes due to a lack of funding. And now we have these ambitious targets to protect 30% of land and sea, and this is a growing area of interest.
Thank you, amazing. Callie, if you can introduce yourself.
So I'm here in Washington, D.C. I started Reserva in 2019. It's an organization that works with youth around the world to try to get young people engaged in conservation of biodiversity hotspots. So for the last 4 years, we've been working in Ecuador primarily, supporting the creation of the world's first youth-funded nature reserve and working with a local partner called Fundación Ecominga in the northwest of Ecuador in the tropical Andes. So we helped create a reserve and expand a really cool protected area called Dracula Reserve there, about 1,300 acres or so that we've helped support. And yeah, looking forward to chatting with you guys. I'm going to go try to figure out this camera thing.
Cool. I'll do just a brief introduction of who I am. My name is Alexandra Climent, and I am the founder of Endangered Rainforest Rescue. Endangered Rainforest Rescue is based in the Darien Gap of Panama. And through this nonprofit, I do work to preserve endangered tropical tree species in the area, basically by collecting samples of barks, leaves, and seeds in order to restore areas of depleted land throughout Panama that have been deforested at an unfortunate rapid pace. And in conjunction to this, we are working alongside the government and other organizations to protect indigenous land there. So let's start out with some questions here. So since we all seemingly work in the global south, my question first is, how does biodiversity in your specific region of work compare, and why is it crucial to preserve in your area? So John, maybe do you want to start?
Sure. Thanks, Alexandra. So I'm speaking to you now from Medellin, Colombia. And I've done work in many different countries, but most of my work with protected areas has been in Colombia. And Colombia has the highest concentration of highest biodiversity per square meter in any country in the world. But what a lot of people sometimes forget, including people in Colombia, is that Colombia has the only country in South America with two coasts, Caribbean coast and a Pacific coast. And it's 50% land. It's also a country that's 50% ocean. And part of that coastline is kind of they're very contrasting. The Caribbean has had a lot of development and a lot of degradation. And then on the Pacific side, you're on the Eastern Tropical Pacific, which is some of the most productive waters on the entire planet. And some of the most important areas, some of the most important habitat in the world for several species of sharks, some of the most intact mangroves in the Western Hemisphere. And so I'm speaking today, I can speak a little bit to some of the biodiversity, in the interior in Colombia, but particularly my area of expertise is the ocean. And that's sometimes, the most biodiverse country in the world is a very important part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Justin?
Yeah, so Indonesia, I mean, it sits right there on the equator, just north of Australia. And our work primarily takes us to Borneo, so West Kalimantan, it's like the Western Borneo side. But we have partners all over Indonesia that also we work with to kind of use our core model and kind of replicate some of the work we're doing. But man, Indonesia's got so much biodiversity. It's incredible. Even with just looking at the forests, it's got some of the world's most dense mangrove forests, which is really, really great for sequestering carbon, which is a huge buffer for mitigating climate change. And then you look on land, it's got some like really, really dense rainforests and everything. And that's also really, really good for pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And then you look at, species that you can find in Indonesia. You've got elephants, you've got tigers, you've got orangutans, you've got leopards, you've got all kinds of cool species that are all interacting. And if you really think about the number of species that we still don't know that are out there, I think a majority of them are found in Indonesia, especially when it comes to like insect diversity as well. And all of that is so linked to the livelihoods of the people who live there. Indonesia has so many islands and there are reefs and all sorts of fisheries around that, so Indonesia provides a lot of the world's fisheries and the food from going out there and fishing out of the oceans. And all the biodiversity there is so so well linked with the people's livelihoods there that, like, if anything happens to that biodiversity, it's immediately felt within the communities that are living there. And so there's a lot of challenges to it in that area. There's a lot of exploitation that you get from outside players, especially with palm oil, mining, fishing, people coming in from other countries and doing illegal fishing. And so that's impacting the biodiversity in a negative way, which also impacts all of the communities that live there.
Yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, that's something I hear a lot. Callie, are you?
The video is still not working. I have no idea why. It says it should be.
Don't worry about it.
But I'll continue to chip in and listen while I figure this out.
Sure. Yeah. So similarly to both of what you said, where I work in the Darien Gap, I would say is so unique because of its location between Panama and Colombia, and the history of the geographical region there is so interesting, because if you actually looked at a timeline of the Earth's history, the Darien Gap is one of the newest places on Earth. So if you went back millions and millions of years, the Darien would appear right at the very end. And that's really special because that opened up migratory pathways for animal and plant species between the two continents for the first time. So in the Darien, you're holding a breathtaking amount of endemic species and endangered tree species, endangered species of all kinds. But for me, that's why I focused my project in the Darien, is because a lot of the endangered tree species that I was looking for had a much higher probability of being found in this area versus other parts where they've been completely wiped out. So much like you said, Justin, the people also rely heavily on the biodiversity in this area, and that's why incorporating protecting the indigenous lands is so important, alongside protecting the trees. The trees kind of are the first line in protecting the habitat. So if we're saving those trees, we're saving the land and we're saving the animal species that come along with it. So that's just one of the major reasons why the Darien Gap is so biodiverse.
So the area that that I'm working in is just south of you. I'm in Ecuador, and we're working in the Tropical Andes Biodiversity Hotspot, which is the most endemic biodiversity hotspot in the world. For anyone who's not familiar with that term, it just means species in this area are unique to, or like more unique to the zones they live in. It could be endemic to the country or endemic to one side of one mountain. But the reserve that we're working in, which I'll talk about today, is called Dracula Reserve, and it's on the western slopes of the Andes Mountains in the cloud forest. And what's really cool about this area and the biodiversity that lives there is with the steep slopes of these mountains and the evolution over time, species that evolved on the top or along these slopes of these mountains are really unique to that specific climate, those specific climatic conditions, and so they don't easily exist at the bottom of the mountain or through a valley and over into the next mountain range. So as we face this biodiversity crisis with 1,000 times the natural rate of extinction, I think it's really important that we focus on these areas of endemism to protect the greatest number of species that are unique to certain areas.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and that's a perfect segue into this next question about how is climate change contributing to the loss of biodiversity in the regions that you all work. And what would you say, what ecosystems and species are most at risk because of
that? Should we go backward? I can just
whatever you guys want.
So just to follow up on that, speaking about the Andes, one of the most diverse species groups where we are is orchids. There are at least 400 species of orchids on this reserve, which is about 6,000 acres. And of those species, only 7 of them have been assessed on the IUCN Red List. So there's so much more information we need to know about these. But a lot of these orchids are incredibly sensitive to humidity changes, temperature changes, the elevation. And so part of the reason that we're focused on protecting whole mountain sides is the altitudinal gradient that these mountains offer. So as the climate changes and temperatures change, we need to provide species the ability to climb up the mountain to get to cooler and more humid areas. And so one of the big threats is once they reach the top, or the species that have evolved to be at the top, where are they going to go? They don't have anywhere else to go. So we're really worried about these more high altitude species that have nowhere to climb, if species can indeed climb quickly enough.
That's also something that we're working on in the Darien Gap. It's very similar. A lot of the species that I'm looking for of trees that are endangered and are only at the top of these cloud forests. So expeditions have to evolve into being able to climb and explore these areas that are very difficult with visibility and very unexplored. And it's also the same with the IUCN Red List. When it comes to endangered tree species and vulnerable tree species, I mean, it's from my personal knowledge that it's really lacking. It's really not represented what's actually been lost. And that's why I work so closely with the indigenous communities that live even within these cloud forests to figure out what they believe is going extinct and what is endangered. And I've actually been providing some information back to the Yale Environmental Institute and the Smithsonian about the endangered tree species that they don't yet have on the IUCN Red List. So. Justin or John, do you want to add on to that question about climate change?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot the order.
We're just kind of at this point, but I'll get back to it if we need to.
Yeah, I would say that, climate change has a huge impact on biodiversity in communities living in Indonesia, especially because Indonesia has so many islands. The big obvious one is going to be sea level rising. It's causing a lot of like flooding of some of the lower elevation islands. There's a lot of communities that are built in coastal habitats. Lots of communities are actually built on platforms over top of the ocean. And as sea levels rise, that's causing those communities to sort of be washed out. And it's not just like the sea level rises consistently and then all of a sudden they're washed out. It's tides that are coming in farther than they've come in before, or like, you know, weather events that push water around in ways that it hasn't necessarily done that before, which is causing a lot of these issues. Another big thing is coral bleaching because the ocean temperature is rising. I'll let John talk more about that, and I'll switch more to land so I don't take too many of his things. But like, just like Callie said, a lot of the cloud forests in Indonesia, the altitude is going up because of the way that the humidity is, and a lot of these species don't really have anywhere to go. And weather is changing to the point where a lot of the areas that were extremely humid and wet are becoming a little bit more dry. And, when people go out and they set fire to kind of clear the land for agriculture, those fires often get out of control because the habitat's a lot drier than what it historically has been. And so instead of burning like a hectare or two, which was intended, they're burning hundreds of thousands of hectares, and it's all by accident. But it's because the conditions have changed very recently that, it's hard to control these wildfires. And so that's one of the big things that is devastating these regions, and especially in Indonesia now. A lot of species, are fleeing it. And unlike, parts of America where some of these habitats are dependent upon wildfires, like you got gymnosperms that or pine trees that need to have like that fire in order to reproduce. Indonesia is not necessarily like that. So it's having a drastic impact on their forest and on their habitats, and having a very negative impact on the communities there.
Mhm. So, as we trickle down, I kind of like this order because we're slowly trickling down from the mountains down to the ocean. But, those tropical, the Andean forests, of course, a very important ecosystem in Colombia as well, but moving down towards the coast. On the Pacific side, the Eastern Tropical Pacific is one of the most sensitive regions in the world to El Nino patterns. And we're entering what could be a very strong El Nino at this moment. And with climate change, we are expecting to potentially see more extreme El Ninos more frequently. And that can result in mass coral bleaching, changes in upwelling patterns in this part of the world that impact plankton, that impact fish, that are the crux of all the rest of the biodiversity that are dependent on predating on those species. And then on the Caribbean side right now, you've heard of the 101 degree Fahrenheit temperatures in Florida, for example. This is something that's happening. We're seeing a mass coral bleaching event throughout the Caribbean at this moment. And because of these warming waters. And Colombia is one of the countries that has had some of the coral reefs from the Caribbean side have hit that maximum alert level. So I don't know at the moment what the status of the reefs are as far as bleaching goes, but we'll see. But it's scary to see. And a lot of these reef systems, there are indigenous and Afro-indigenous communities that are dependent on these for subsistence-based fishing, things like that. And then to tie back also to indigenous communities, an interesting story. On the Caribbean coast, Colombia has what is the highest or the second highest coastal mountain range in the world. You can be sitting underneath the coconut tree in the Caribbean and look behind you and see glaciers at 19,000 feet. And the indigenous groups there, the Arhuacos and the Kogis, believe that that mountain system is the literal center of the universe, because every ecosystem in the world that you can think of is pretty much represented, from deserts to rainforests to almost like alpine tundra to glaciers in one form or another. And they believe that what is happening there is a reflection of what's happening across the entire world. And as the glaciers there are receding and they're seeing more extended droughts, more extreme weather patterns, you can't say that they're wrong.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's sad because it seems like we're all kind of saying the same things, I mean, in different ways, but we're seeing all parts of the world be affected by this. So, John, you touched on this a little bit about how the local and indigenous people in those communities are affected. Their livelihoods are affected because they rely on the biodiversity in the area. Hey, Callie.
Hi. I had to quit and rejoin.
Oh, there you go. I'm glad you're here. Nice to see your face. But yeah, so speaking about how the indigenous people and the local people are affected by climate change and these weather changes, how would you say, are there any specific industries in the regions where you work that you can see are directly affected by this already?
So,
Callie, you want to jump in? Or John? Yeah.
Here, Callie, why don't you haven't had you've been trying to get your camera going. So
well, I can definitely say something about that. We, especially in a mountainous area, climate change has increased the volatility of the landscape. And where we're working, there's a lot of agricultural deforestation. And in an area like a cloud forest, where the soil's not actually that strong, like it's not actually that good, when there's a lot of deforestation and the sun penetrates the soil and kind of destroys mycelium networks that are supposed to exist in the shade, it destabilizes the soil quite a lot. And so with climate change and increasing severe weather events, we have seen a massive increase in landslides. And of course, those can take away, livelihoods, take away crops, but of course, they can also take away human lives. And so climate change is a serious concern for our area, especially in the more disturbed parts of the habitat.
Yeah. And definitely the same pattern here in Colombia with the landslides, and in a country where it has suboptimal road infrastructure. A small 2-lane road might be the only connector to a city of 120,000 people.
Yeah.
So if that gets washed out, also we have isolated populations. Colombia is also very dependent on hydropower, and we've been seeing more extended droughts. And during some of those longer droughts, some of the major cities start dealing with more blackouts. And in the lower regions, the Amazon, one of the concerns there is the long-term slow aeration of it, right? These extended drought periods in the Amazon as well, and that relates, particularly for some indigenous communities or cities there, it causes more and more challenges with potable water supply in a lot of regions, and we see that in the Caribbean coast as well, particularly in the Northeast where it's more arid. A lot of problems with droughts and water supply.
Yeah, I think we're seeing an abundance of drought in the Darien as well, and same thing, mudslides. It's definitely been increase in storms in general. So traveling, the communities use the rivers; they're like their highways, and it's increasingly more difficult to go anywhere because they can't predict the tides as easily as they used to. And also something a little bit more off the natural disasters of climate change, but is the human impact of climate change affecting the migration in the Darien Gap. And as some people know, the Darien is an entrance point for migrants to come from the global south, mostly to reach the United States. So this area is not only facing the natural disasters, but they're seeing such an increase in people who have to leave their homes. And that has been devastating for the migrants who've had to cross through this pretty treacherous jungle. And that's only part of their journey to the United States. So we're dealing with that crisis as well.
Yeah, I mean, we all work in tropical areas, so a lot of our issues are very, very, very similar. So same thing in Indonesia, the weather patterns are changing, it's causing landslides, it's isolating communities, cutting them off from having access to things like education and healthcare a lot of the times. And so that's an area in which the organization I work for, we help develop programs to help isolated communities, increasingly isolated communities, form these governance structures and create these programs to be able to be self-sufficient, especially now. And so it's extremely rewarding, and we're kind of working to try to outpace the impact of the climate impacts that it's having in Indonesia.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure we can all talk about that for hours. But to move a little bit away from that, I mean, not completely unrelated, but to talk a little bit about ecotourism. This is something that I think I've been a little bit confused about, and I kind of am always changing my opinions. So I just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on ecotourism and what's that like in the areas that you work? Is it helping the local economy? Is it increasing deforestation? How does that balance happen? I would love to hear.
Sure.
You guys.
I mean, as you know, conservation finance is one of my areas of expertise, and of course, funding from ecotourism is really important. But there is always still impact with any sort of amount of tourism and how that's measured, and also how are local communities, including indigenous communities, actually benefiting, and are they seeing the benefits? So you can see good tourism practices in that respect. You also see harmful tourism practices, where let's say you have a mega resort where it's owned by a foreign company and they're hiring and bringing foreigners in there. That's not helping benefit the local populations, and so it's not going to help. Basically, for example, if you're trying to mitigate pressure on fishing, it's not going to help with that either, and it's not going to help kind of align interests. So one of the things that are always really important to look at is ecotourism for funding conservation, but also for providing benefits to local communities, including indigenous communities. How are they actually benefiting from that? In Colombia, I would say it's mixed. There have been a lot of areas that have gotten a lot of benefits from tourism. There are areas definitely with some degree of over-tourism, you could say, particularly in the Caribbean, where there's a lot of pressure on the environment from the number of people. One thing, though, that is good to see is that for one of the most visited areas, Tayrona National Park, which is on the foot of those mountains, Sierra Nevada, Santa Marta, that I was talking about earlier, is that the government does give certain rights to the indigenous communities there to actually close the park for 1 or 2 months a year to kind of let it respirar, to breathe, as they say. And what's kind of really cool is that when they do that, they do sometimes put some biologists there on the ground to see what happens, and the speed at which nature kind of takes back over, and the animals that start venturing to these areas that are usually kind of tourists is a lot faster than what a lot of people would realize. I think it's a testament to the ability for nature to recover if we kind of let it.
Nice. Yeah, for me, in working with Planet Indonesia, ecotourism isn't necessarily something that we have really gotten into. We primarily work with indigenous communities that are rural and live near or in protected areas. And so, ecotourism is not necessarily much of an option or something that we get into. But one of the other hats that I wear as director and co-founder of a production company called Running Wild Media, we do lead eco-tours around the world. And so basically what it looks like is we bring people who are interested in doing wildlife photography, and we take them out into areas that we have worked professionally based on contacts that we've made in country. And one thing that we're very, very careful of is making sure that our money goes to people who live in that area and go to businesses that are owned by local indigenous people. And so it takes a little bit of research on someone's part who is interested in going on like an eco tour to make sure that the resort you're going to is actually owned and managed by people who are local and not managed by a company based in Europe but operating in Costa Rica. And so that's like a huge, huge thing. There's a really good place in Costa Rica that I go to where one of my friends who I've gotten to know over the years, he has his own little resort place, but it's on his land that he owns, and he takes the money and he works with the Costa Rican Zoo to reintroduce threatened frog on his property. And so it's an area that this frog species is actually thriving. Another example is in Indonesia. I have another friend who lives right next to Tanjung Puting, which is a very popular place to go see orangutans, and he owns his own business, his own ecotourism business, and it's all operated by locals, and he has to compete with people who have these multi-million-dollar companies that are advertising to people all over the world. And so, when you're trying to go on an eco tour, that's like the most important thing, is to just make sure that it's impacting locals, the local economy, and you're not paying into an organization or a company that's based anywhere else.
I'd imagine that I probably have some of the same challenges, or the region I'm working has probably some of the same challenges that Alexandra might have, or that some of y'all have. But we're located right along the Colombian border, so it's technically a red zone, State Department red zone, level 4, do not travel. And so I think when we think of ecotourism, especially in the tropics, we kind of imagine international tourists coming to visit. But really, the best ecotourism that we've had in this area is not part of our business model. It's not part of our main thing, but is local tourism. So we have, it's been really rewarding to see as we promote the reserve within its province, within Carchi province, where this reserve is. Most people from the capital of the province don't know that they have cloud forests and that they have these incredible species that living there. And so promoting it as a place that's just a day trip away has actually benefited not just the local communities with a little bit of income. There's homestays and just people buying food at the local restaurant, but also just people being aware of the reserve and celebrating it within the scope of their province. And it's now been named a municipal reserve because of this increased level of awareness. So I like to think of ecotourism as an actual kind of awareness mechanism locally, rather than kind of in the traditional sense of like lots of money coming in from abroad to fund an area. I don't know if you've experienced the same thing, Alexandra, with like the red zone thing.
Yeah,
visit.
Yeah, I think that people, especially Panamanians, they think of the Darien Gap and they have absolutely no desire to go there. People from outside as well, they know it as the most dangerous jungle in the world, and there's really no tourism there. There's some spots that have popped up, some tours, but not in a large way, which I appreciate. But recently, in one of the areas on the Pacific coast where I have a nursery, there's an indigenous community that I'm very close with there. And there's been some tourism introduced into that area. And it's been interesting to kind of see it unfold, both good and bad. And that's kind of what I'm trying to digest now, from working in a place for over 8 years where there's been basically no tourism. It has brought them some money for sure, but it's also caused a bit of deforestation, because now they're trying to build kind of platforms to look out over into the Pacific, and they need to grow more food, so they're clearing more forests for that. And the good thing is, at least the money is going to them. But there's also been a divide in the community, because you have the people who are still practicing traditional indigenous culture, and then you have people who have kind of broken away from that, with the missionaries and the church. So now they're kind of against each other, and they've both created separate tourist spots. And so I still haven't figured out how I feel about it. I guess it's very new, and I will see how it unfolds. But it's really interesting to hear what you all have to say, and I will keep you all updated on how that goes. But I'm trying to use the work that I do there with the nursery as a bridge. It is a small enough place where I can actually maybe make a difference there by bringing them together, and at least the children from the two separated sides, to learn to plant the trees and the seeds and bring them back out into the forest to replant on the deforested land. So I'm trying to do a small part in that and interest.
Yeah, I just want to quickly say that like it's such a hard thing to think about because there's so many ways ecotourism is done, and there's not like a right way, and there's really no governing body anywhere in the world. And so it's like people making individual preferences and decisions and calling like sometimes something will be called ecotourism and it's absolutely not. And so it's tough because that falls on the consumer to make decisions that they think is right, and they get greenwashed so hard with the ecotourism thing that it's just a really tough place to navigate. And so that's kind of why it's like, I mean, we could have a whole panel on ecotourism and talk about all the horrible things that we've seen and all the great things that we've seen, but there's really just everything in between, and that's why it's so tough to be like for it or against
I would add
it,
to
you
that,
know?
when it's done well, it can have a variety of benefits for all stakeholder groups. One of the areas, one of the
Yeah.
national parks I've worked with in the southwest coast of Colombia, kind of getting down towards the Ecuador border. There's a concession there. There's a tourism operator on this island. It's called Gorgona Island. It's about 20 miles off the coast. The previous operator was actually a company from Bogota that sourced food from the capital city region, brought in employees from that region. They broke their contract because the area was hit by the armed conflict, and so they dropped it. But then a new tourism operator picked it up, who was a local Pacific Coast organization, hired locally, sourced food locally, and what that did is it not only made for a more authentic experience for a lot of people visiting, it provided financial benefits to local communities. It helped improve stakeholder relations in that respect, which have helped with kind of the collaboration and the enforcement and the overall performance of that national park. So there's benefits for the local stakeholder groups. There's benefits for the government as far as achieving their conservation objectives, which always depends on some degree of aligned interest with local communities. So it kind of builds ownership in that respect. And in some parts of the country, you've seen ecotourism in Colombia outright stop massive development projects. Further north in the coast, going to Chocó, when you start getting towards the Darien Gap, the government wanted to build a large deep water port that would have taken out a ton of mangroves as an area, as an important nursery area for humpback whales. It would have done a lot of devastation, but some of the local groups, the Afro-Indigenous groups, who actually have descendants of slave colonies, who have been living remotely for hundreds of years, actually do have some sort of indigenous type recognition as far as land titles and things like that. And they stopped the road from being built into that region. That was what the deciding factor was that ultimately halted the development of this port. And then where I'm going this weekend is a river that is the last free flowing river in this part of Colombia, Rio Samaná, doing a two-day expedition down that river. And the development of whitewater rafting and kayaking tourism, even though it's very, very small, provided an economic rationale for a group of people to fight against building a dam on that river. So again, it's one of those things where it can have harmful impacts, but when it's done right, it can have a wide variety of benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Justin, I think you're right. I think we need a whole panel just on this. And we're like almost out of time, but I just want to, since we started a little bit late, maybe they'll let us have one more question. So speaking about those land rights that you mentioned, Johnny, I would love to talk a little bit more about that in the regions where you all work, what those land rights look like. And then I know this is a little bit separate, but also how the indigenous knowledge from having those rights to the land and living on those lands has helped you.
Yeah, I could start. One of the big things that we do at Planet Indonesia is work with the government and the communities that we partner with to help facilitate the granting of the land rights back, and that's like a huge thing because, not having the rights to the land that your community has lived in for hundreds of thousands of years, like really disturbs you economically, culturally. And so because of that, because of a lot of some of the policies and things that have happened in the past, a lot of the communities we partner with don't have access to it. And so that doesn't really allow them to build livelihoods that are resilient to things like climate change or, natural disasters. And so they rely on like day-to-day sustenance living, which looks like natural resource extraction oftentimes. And that allows a lot of these players to come in, like international corporations and stuff, and take advantage of that chaos and build palm oil plantations or pay locals to poach local wildlife, because the communities are just looking for something to hold them over so that they can feed their families. And really, it's until they have those land rights back and those customary rights that they can start building the infrastructure needed in order to support themselves. And then these community members that we partner with, they all want to be conservationists. They love the forest, they love the species that are out there, and it's something that they want to do, but it's because of the way that their rights have been stripped, and the way that the government has, the relationship they have with the government has opened up this this narrative where these communities are going in and just trying to survive and doing these things. And so that's a big thing that we do. And we work with 69 communities through these governance structures and getting them land rights back and everything. And it's something that the government has recognized as an issue. And they do have a program where communities can go through the legal process to get those land rights back. But that's even like a whole hurdle and a whole legal thing that like no one's really even equipped to manage. And so we help with that, like trying to get that back. And they made it, a little bit too difficult. And it's something that shouldn't have even been a thing, but it's just the reality of it. So, and that's huge. Like once we see a community get their land rights back, deforestation decreases. I mean, we've seen 70% decrease in deforestation around these communities that get their rights back, and poaching decreases, health goes up, literacy goes, like there's so many benefits to it. And it's a bit frustrating that it's taken this long to recognize that, and that their rights were even taken away to begin with, but that's just what we do with it.
I guess I can go next. So our specific project is wedged between a kind of national protected area and the Iowa Indigenous territory. And so which is a huge territory. And that means that there are a lot of Iowa people who are living in the communities that are scattered around the reserve, but the reserve and the lands that are in and around it are as private lands, and the reserve is constructed is built from land purchases from individuals who own their land or who have had their land for sometimes hundreds of years. And part of the process is helping them get titles to their land, clear up the borders, get the titles so that they can legally transfer if they're interested in selling. And I would say that obviously that's a necessary process for creating a private protected area. But one of the things I'm really concerned about is having, like, even when people do have the rights, even when they do have their titles, those rights being violated by multinational companies who take advantage of the fact that property rights are not well understood and that property boundaries are not often well marked. Just last week, we had there was an international, it's like a Canadian and Australian mining company that walked straight onto a piece of land, 1,050 acres, that we just funded the purchase of this piece of land, but it's still in the titling, or it's still in the the transfer process. But they have absolutely no permission to be on it. And they destroyed a canyon right on the land. That was just last week. And it was the fourth time they've come on that land and been told, you are not allowed here. This is the boundary. And every time they just say, well, we didn't know about the boundary. And so what's the point of having rights if companies who have a lot more power than you are going to violate them and not face consequences? So it's a multiplied problem.
And I think to speak to a little bit on how can indigenous knowledge help our conservation work. One area which can help in marine conservation is particularly in fisheries. There's a phenomenon called shifting baseline theory, and what it basically means is that and it started by looking at scientists and how in order to understand the level of degradation and how to plan the recovery of an ecosystem, you have to have some sort of understanding of what does a healthy ecosystem for that region, what does it look like? And what some scientists, some fishery scientists realize is that a lot of people working in fisheries were biased towards the state of the ecosystem when they were in grad school. So even for scientists, we're susceptible to our own perceptions of what a healthy environment is like. And turns out that our perceptions of what a healthy environment is like is still a degraded one. And so communities that have been as part of these ecosystems for hundreds of thousands of years can be quite helpful in that understanding through passing down that knowledge of what does a healthy ecosystem in this region actually look like.
That's such a good point. So glad you said that.
Guys, we're completely out of time and over, but I just want to say one thing quickly about the Indigenous knowledge for my project in particular. I would not be able to do any of the work that I have done with Endangered Rainforest Rescue without the Indigenous people, because of that lack of research that I was telling you about, and just their deep understanding of this area has been everything to my project. So it would not exist without them. So I loved this today. I feel like we need to make this a thing where we all get together and talk, because we have so much in common. This was so much fun for me, and there may be some questions in here, but we don't have time to answer them. So if you don't mind, I'll share your email addresses maybe with everyone if they want to reach out for some questions. And yeah, thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thanks,
Yeah, thank
guys.
you.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra.
So much more to talk about.
I know, so much more.